Let's discuss the highlights on day one of the United Nations General Assembly. I'm joined by international affairs analyst Yuria Francelli. Thank you for joining us on the news this hour. The United Nations may be far from being united in the real sense of it, considering that four of the five veto-wielding permanent members of the UN Secretary Council are absent at the ongoing General Assembly. What does this really mean for this year's summit and the type of consensus that is to be anticipated?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. We have to remember that the UN General Assembly is the main event, the main international event to gather leaders from all around the world to discuss the main topics, the main challenges. And when 4 out of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are not present, it points out for an institutional crisis of the international organizations. And we also have to remember that this is not the first event this year that this happens. When you look back at the G20 meetings in India, the same thing happened. Well, Vladimir Putin was not present because he had this warrant against him by the International Criminal Court. And also Chinese President Xi Jinping was another international leader that didn't show up. It points out for crisis of the international institutions. And if the leaders want to sort it out, find a common solution to this crisis, they at least should be together discussing this, which is probably not happening, at least in this year's General Assembly.
Again, we see in the Russian-Ukraine war headline in this event. Yesterday, we had an outright blame of Russia for its war in Ukraine, as echoed by Joe Biden and Zelensky. The central message was, if you allow Ukraine carved up, how safe is the independence of every other nation? Do you think that the war in Europe is taking the spotlight away from other leaders' appeals and priorities like the climate and economic crisis at this event?
I think some leaders, as for instance, Brazilian President Lula, Brazil is traditionally the first country to address the General Assembly. We open the debates every year. And I think Brazilian leader, President Lula, he did a good job when it comes, for example, to the word of the disasters that are being caused by climate change. He mentioned the floods in Libya. He also mentioned floods that we had back in the south of Brazil a few weeks ago. And what I think that the discussion about the war in Europe does is that it brings out some resentment in the global south, because the global south think, and when I say the global south, I mean mostly African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries. These countries, they feel that their problems are not being properly addressed by the Western countries, such as European countries and North American countries. When it comes to, for example, refugee crisis, what happened right after the war started? We saw people in Europe opening their houses, government making plans to send money to people who hosted these refugees in the homes. And it's not something that happens when, for example, African refugees enter Europe. When it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, same thing happened.
Absolutely. I understand that year in, year out, there are issues that seem to headline events of this nature, and particularly for some stakeholders who are also concerned about the economic realities back at home. They're looking forward to how conversations like these can be genuine and, open-minded enough to also cater to them. But it was President Zelensky's first in-person appearance at the summit since the war began, and he's now questioned Russia's membership in the United Nations, calling on the body's dedication to protecting state sovereignty. He's also raised some very grave concerns about using food and energy, weaponizing food, nuclear power, even weaponizing the possibility of weaponizing artificial intelligence. How important are these concerns, and how do you think the United Nations should be reacting?
I think it's very difficult to say how the United Nations should act as an institution, because Russia was condemned by a UN resolution last year. More than 140 countries voted for the condemnation of Russia. But I think this debate has to be done in every other instance that is possible to find. For example, other forums as the G20, as the G7, everywhere that it can be addressed so countries can get together and find a common solution. It's not very common for us to see Zelensky outside Ukraine. If we also pay attention, his speech was made in English, so it can be more moving for people that hear it everywhere in the world. Zelensky needs not only to try to convince world leaders to support him, but also he needs to touch the world's entire population, because the money that is sent to Ukraine as military, as humanitarian aid, it is money from the taxpayers' pocket that is not converted into national investment in health, education. So he needs the general population of the world also to support him. He traveled to the United States with two main objectives. The first one was to try to convince American Congress to release more than $20 billion in military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And the second one was to try to court the countries of the global south to help break Russia's economy by also adhering to the international sanctions and thus stop the war.
Interesting.